Following the success of the original Splinter Cell game, it was inevitable that a sequel would be in the works. In fact, 2 sequels were immediately planned and being developed shortly after the release of the first game. Ubisoft's main development team, Ubisoft Montreal, started working on the 3rd installment, Splinter Cell Chaos Theory, whilst their secondary team, Ubisoft Shanghai, worked on the immediate sequel that we're looking at today, Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell Pandora Tomorrow. There's a lot to unpack here, so you'll have to bear with me as I ramble on. Firstly, we need to discuss the title of this video, the game Ubisoft doesn't want to sell. This is the only main series installment of the Splinter Cell franchise that isn't available for purchase anywhere. It's not on Steam, it's not on Good Old Games, or Ubisoft's very own store, or anywhere else for digital download. You cannot currently legally purchase a copy of Pandora Tomorrow brand new. The reason for this is that it doesn't really work. Much like some of the issues we had in the original game, where certain lighting effects wouldn't work without tinkering with some game files, the same is true here for Pandora Tomorrow, except none of it works. On modern graphics cards, the game can't render shadows or dynamic lights at all, and in a game so centered around these 2 elements, it's completely unplayable. So instead of, fixing their broken unplayable game, Ubisoft just won't sell it to you. You can still buy old physical copies of the game on the likes of eBay for the price of a Tesco meal deal. I even found a sealed copy for £1 somehow. But this is pretty moot, since most people I know don't have a CD drive on their PC. I certainly don't, and the CD key would most definitely have been used by now, so you'd need to crack the key regardless. So how do you play Pandora Tomorrow? Well, you pirate it, essentially, and then you fix it yourself. Some talented fans figured out an easy fix that repairs all the lighting and shadow issues and upscales the game to modern resolutions, much like some of the fixes for the first game. There are loads of different ways to go about this, so it can be a little intimidating at first. I found a super handy all-in-one download that features the single-player game in its entirety, as well as the appropriate fixes and adjustments needed to run the game on modern machines. I'll link that download in the description, and the files are all pre-tinkered with, so it's as simple as running the exe and you're playing. So with that out of the way, what's the actual game like? Well, there's certainly more of a focus on story, that's for sure. I honestly couldn't really tell you what happened in the original Splinter Cell in terms of story, bar some international trouble regarding Georgia, that's about all I've got. Here there's a big bad guy terrorist, formerly CIA trained, classic, and his gaggle of bad guy friends who are upset at the United States poking their nose in some heated diplomatic affairs in the form of some sort of civil war in Indonesia. So Hadi Sudono, the big bad guy in question, who by the way is definitely inspired by Che Guevara, leads his terrorist group with a scheme known as Pandora Tomorrow. His plan involves a bunch of hidden biological bombs planted on US soil, primed and ready to release the smallpox virus. Millions of lives are at risk, and he's using this to blackmail and force the American government to withdraw from Indonesia, giving him the upper hand in its cause. That's it in a nutshell, but quite a lot more goes on. While seemingly cliché and shallow on the surface, some key plot points are really quite interesting and well developed. I won't spoil them here, but overall, in terms of story, Pandora Tomorrow isn't too shabby. The gameplay is largely unchanged from the first game. You still play as Sam Fisher with some night vision goggles and high-tech spy gear, and you still skulk around shadows, sneaking by cameras and knocking out unsuspecting guards. Most of the changes are more like quality of life upgrades. Sam has some fancy new moves to let you better take advantage of your surroundings. I guess he did some extra training between the 2 games, and you can finally open doors whilst carrying a body. Sam's also learnt how to whistle, useful for luring guards into the darkness, and Third Echelon have clearly been given a bigger budget, as Sam now has access to a laser sight on his pistol. No more whiffing shots at point blank range for you. There are some strange choices made, like health packs now being at stationary points in every level, rather than being able to take one with you. It's fine, I guess. In the previous game I found it interesting to have to juggle my medkits, like not knowing whether I'd need one later on in the mission, or using them in a pinch after I mess up a tough section. Now you're at the mercy of the level designers for when you can replenish any health lost. I'm pretty neutral on the issue, but I can understand why this annoyed some people. One excellent change is that your light meter will now flash when carrying a body to indicate you'll be dumping it in a well-concealed spot, a far cry from the seemingly random alarms of the original game due to not knowing whether or not a body was hidden appropriately. As far as gameplay goes though, that's pretty much it. But what else is new? Well, the graphics have been improved overall, the excellent lighting and shadows remain pretty much the same, but some extra care has clearly been put into the texture work and modelling. Cutscenes still look a little weird, but at least they're in a higher resolution now. One thing that did stand out to me was the quality of some of the animations. Base animations such as running, climbing, shooting, etc. they've just been pulled from the first game and they're still fine. New animations, however, aren't so good. There's a pretty stark difference in how smooth they are. It's almost as if the original animations were done with motion capture and new ones were hand animated. I don't know enough about the technological constraints of the time and whether or not mocap was even a viable option for a game like this, but it's the only explanation I can think of. New animations are janky and unnatural looking compared to some of the original ones. It's not a game breaker, but it feels like a step back in this regard. Some of the scripted events do look great though, much more bombastic and elaborate than the first game. This is a bit of a double-edged sword in that some sequences feel very Hollywood compared to the much more grounded approach I expected, but it certainly is still fun to watch. This is probably a good time to talk about why some of these changes took place and why perhaps Pandora Tomorrow doesn't quite feel as polished as its predecessor. This is largely down to the development team. I touched on this briefly in the last video when talking about the different versions of the OG Splinter Cell, and some of those same issues still exist. Put simply, the inferior PS2 and GameCube versions were handled by Ubisoft's B team, Ubisoft Shanghai, and that same team was in charge of every version of Pandora Tomorrow. The PS2 and GameCube versions of the sequel are still lesser versions of the Xbox and PC versions, but to an even greater extent here. Frame rates are choppier, textures are worse, it's just not the way to play the game. Sure, it's easier just to chuck a disc in your old console, but trust me, the extra effort on getting the PC version working is absolutely worth it. This is the best way to experience the game yet again. Oh, and steer clear of the PS3 HD remake. There's enough issues to warrant a whole new video. It's just not worth it, don't do it. Ubisoft Shanghai were a smaller and more inexperienced team at the time, and whilst they very clearly cared about the project and certainly made some strides on improving the original, there are many instances where if they didn't take a step backwards, it was at least just a step sideways. Remember in the first review when I said I never felt cheated when getting spotted? Yeah, that's no longer the case. I called BS so many times on my playthrough.
Is somebody shooting?
Guards spot you way more easily here, and they have much better hearing too. I got caught time and time again by guards I couldn't even see myself. And in the first game, if you messed up and got spotted, you usually had a few seconds to shoot the guy before he ran to an alarm and hit the button, or call for backup on his radio. Now it feels almost random when that happens, and half the time an alarm gets immediately, and impossibly might I add, raised. It's not fun. It's a false difficulty spike for seemingly no reason. Sure, there were absolutely instances in the first game where I should have been detected, but the fix to this isn't to make guards superhuman, just smarter. Ubisoft Shanghai tried to fix a problem that wasn't really a problem to begin with, and instead created a bigger problem. Eventually I developed a sort of spidey sense for bullshit and managed to steer clear of most alarms, but still got caught out every now and then. Another gripe I have with Pandora Tomorrow is the return and prominence of bad voice acting. Michael Ironside is as ever brilliant, but he's the exception rather than the rule. Oh, and they recast Lambert for some reason. Don Jordan returned as Lambert in every other game bar this one, I guess he was busy. Anyway, the first game had some bad dialogue, but my god does this game's writing suck. I couldn't even laugh this time around, just cringe. At least in the original, the voice actors they got in put on a cheesy accent or two. Here everyone sounds the same. And American.
Are you sure? What should I do? Yes, sir. I understand, sir.
The gunplay is still as enjoyable as stubbing your toe, and there are still forced combat sections, but at least you can hit your targets a bit more easily now. Once again, don't play this game for the guns. On a more positive note, the game runs quite well, especially considering its age. I didn't run into any game-breaking bugs or glitches, there's some pathfinding issues here and there, and there's one guy T-posing, and it only crashed I think twice in my whole playthrough. One major improvement over the first game are the levels. Gone are the copied and pasted office blocks. You get to sneak about in Indonesian jungles, the streets of Jerusalem, the savannas and much more. There are some truly standout levels here, such as boarding and traversing a speeding train and creeping through LAX airport. Levels are less linear with more freedom to approach objectives how you'd like. Sure, you end up in the same place. Where exactly did you expect to be able to go on a train? But the journey can be different. There are even player choices that affect the story. Okay, not really, but there are a few interesting decisions you have to make that doesn't change the overarching story as such, but you're rewarded with some unique dialogue instead. It's not quite Metal Gear Solid, but it's more interesting than the original. I won't showcase any here as they're really quite cool and worth exploring yourself. Overall, Pandora Tomorrow is a sequel that could have done with 10 more minutes in the oven. The story and levels are better, you get some new moves and gadgets, and that's about it. Like I said, it's clear that the developers truly cared about this project and set out to make a good game, but did they set out to make the best game they could? I'm not convinced. But Noah, I hear you cry, What about the innovative, groundbreaking, asymmetrical multiplayer mode, the likes of which we'd never seen before, that you personally adored and poured many an after-school evening into? Yeah, well, you can't play it anymore, obviously. You might be able to get it running via LAN or something like Hamachi, but there was no way I was going to convince 3 friends to purchase second-hand retail copies, crack the keys with me, and then maybe get it working. For those of you that don't know, Pandora Tomorrow shipped with a multiplayer mode in the form of Spies Vs Mercs, and it was glorious. A 2v2 game mode pitting stealth-based and vulnerable spies against tough gun-toting mercenaries. Spies played in the typical fashion of a Splinter Cell game, having to rely on speed, agility and some clever gadgets to outwit their opponents, whilst the mercs had booby traps, more firepower and were much harder to take down. Mercenaries played in the first-person perspective, however, so keeping track of speedy ninjas clad in black darting across a dark room became much more difficult. There are objective-based modes like sabotage or extraction, and honestly it's one of the best multiplayer experiences I've ever had. If you were lucky enough to enjoy it in its heyday, then I envy you. I was a bit too young to fully appreciate the nuance of the multiplayer, but I still remember having tons of fun and playing over and over again. Issues aside, Pandora Tomorrow is still a good game and a decent sequel. It's often overlooked, and I can see why. Even without the difficulties in actually playing the game, there isn't an awful lot of new content here. But if you like stealth games, you could certainly do worse. Pandora Tomorrow is just a single player experience, doesn't quite hit the mark for me in comparison to the first Splinter Cell game. It's good, it has its moments, it also has its issues. But a sequel should push a series forward in new and exciting ways, and the multiplayer did just that, but you can't play it anymore. The single player is still worth playing through if you were a fan of the first game, but don't be surprised if you're left slightly unfulfilled. Arguably the best part of Pandora Tomorrow has been lost to time, which is such a shame. Still, could be worse. Could be Splinter Cell Conviction. I'm kidding, look, we'll get on to Conviction eventually, there's a few more to get through first. Next up is Splinter Cell Chaos Theory, my personal and widely regarded fan favourite. Chaos Theory brings a lot to the table, so look forward to it. Until the next one.